Hello and welcome to our first webinar of the new year. My name is Amelia Larson. I serve as the Executive Vice President of Innovations and Academic Partnerships at American Reading Company. We have a very exciting lineup for this next school year. If you are on social media, remember to use hashtag ArcLearns as you share your learning and contribute to the learning of others. So, vital questions about how to ensure all school-age children learn to read and write well and with confidence have gained even greater urgency in the past year. Today, our conversation is designed to help us think about how acceleration, equity, and personalization improve student learning and outcomes. It is my pleasure to introduce Megan Maloney, ARC's Chief Academic Officer, who will be introducing the panelists for our conversation today. Megan?
Thank you, Amelia, and welcome everyone to our webinar series, and probably going to be one of our best yet. We start our year July 1st, so this is our Happy New Year webinar for American Reading Company. I am honored today to introduce these panelists with such important work that they're doing. First, I want to introduce Tanji Reed-Marshall, Director of Pre-K-12 Practice for the Ed Trust. Prior to joining Ed Trust, Tanji worked at the Office of Academic Programs in Virginia Polytech Institute and State University, where she helped prepare School of Education's accreditation for the Council for Accreditation of Educator Preparation. Before that, she supported prospective secondary English teachers who were working to obtain licensure through the School of Education. Welcome, Tanji. Next, I'd like to introduce Meredith Lieben. Meredith is a designer at the Student Achievement Partners. Meredith has taught for over 30 years in a variety of settings. She is one of a handful of nationally certified literacy coaches for college and career standards for adult basic education, and also loves to work with career and technical teachers along with elementary and middle school teachers, and also was a rock star in a webinar yesterday. Along with Meredith, so did Sue Pimentel join a webinar yesterday that got rave reviews. Sue is actually the founding partner of Student Achievement Partners, and her efforts have been focused on helping communities, districts, and states across the nation work together to advance education reform and champion proven tools for increasing academic rigor. She is co-authored of the recently released paper, Reading is Liberation, an examination of the research base, along with all of our panelists. And last but not least, our fourth panelist today is David Lieben. Also with Student Achievement Partners, David is a consultant and nationally recognized reading expert who is uniquely able to translate research on the brain and reading into practical application for teachers and students. David taught and led schools at all grade levels during a 35-year school-based career. You are in for quite an afternoon, and without further ado, we will begin. Amelia.
All right. So Megan, you mentioned the name of the report, Reading is Liberation. And I believe this report is a game changer, a must read from cover to cover. And I wanted to start with Sue and Meredith. I'm sure you're going to add to it, but what problem was this report trying to solve? How did you bring people together?
So I'll start, and Meredith will join in. So I think, as you said, Amelia, there's great urgency about not meeting all students' needs, that some students were failing some students, and that a one size fits all doesn't really work. And so there's a sense of, especially, the pandemic sort of pulled the curtain open for us to see. I think we knew this, but really pulled it open. And as we were working on what we would call accelerating students' literacy, right? So what does that mean? What does it look like? What does it mean you do? What does it mean you focus on? What does it mean you can let go of? And then at the same time, we knew that personalization was all the rage, but the two never talked. We weren't talking to them, personalization advocates and researchers, and they weren't talking to us. And then there was a sense that undergirding all of what we needed to look at was equity. The report needed to be anchored in equity. The literacy accelerators need to be anchored in equity, as does personalization. So there was a way to say, can we do both and then improve student learning?
This is something that really stood out to me because you brought together researchers, literacy, and equity experts in the same room at the same time. I have not seen this before. So I want to start with well done, congratulations. Meredith or Sue, can you talk a little bit about the organization of this report? How is it different from other white papers we have seen around?
Hopefully it is. It's long though, so it shares that. It is the features that you just identified as uniquely coming together are braided. They can't be teased apart. Inside the literacy accelerators, those can't be teased apart. You can read them separately, but they connect. But as design principles, this idea that equity undergirds all the thinking and all the decision making around literacy practices and how to individualize, how to be respectful of how students from different cultures and backgrounds might want to learn and access learning best. All those things are part and parcel of the report. There are sections, but these underlying principles are woven pretty inextricably. I'd say that's the way I would say it. There's not, I mean, there is an executive summary and all that, but the weave is tight.
And I would only add to that, because I know, okay, it's a white paper, I guess it is. But that can kind of create a big yawn, you know, when you think about that. But what I want you to know is so it says the what, it says the why, it says something of the how, and then it gets really concrete about, well, you know, when you're looking at foundational skills, what's really, really important, and how does personalization interact with that? It gets really specific about equity. You know, it's equity in the delivery of all of this, but it's also equity in the development of all this, which I know, you know, Tanji will talk to us all about. So to me, it's really concrete. And the other thing is, sometimes white papers have to be read from beginning to end, and you know, you can't. If you don't read that, you won't get this. But this, you really can dive into a place that's really interesting to you, and then work out from there, I hope. And there are in the appendices, there's some real consideration questions for those of you who I know I'm seeing from all over the country that are working in districts. How do we make decisions about what we focus on? Do we have the right curriculum? If we have that, what do our students need? And so I hope it differs a little bit from just like a regular white paper.
It does. And that's the reason I started with this. As if you are a practitioner, if you are in the front lines, there is nothing that I have seen that is quite like this. Even the synthesis of the research, how it's organized, it doesn't bore you. You are interested, and then it connects to the recommendations. It is beautifully done. I don't think the field can thank you enough. But this gives me a good segue into, you write that each of the accelerators is essential, but they only genuinely accelerate student literacy when they are exercised together. The implications of this truth have too seldom been appreciated or enacted in the classroom and learning students' experience. This is so true. So David, can you talk a little bit about how you arrived at the 5 literacy accelerators, the drivers, and what was behind the rationale of how you synthesize the research in a manner that is so accessible to everyone?
Well, the 5 elements are pretty well known. You can go back all the way to the National Reading Panel in 2000 of, decode phonics or decoding and word recognition, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Although that knowledge was not there in 2000, we've only discovered after 2000 that you know something about the world in order to be a proficient reader. But I suppose better late than never. So that came from that. The way I went about it was historically, I wanted to present the evolution of our understanding in each area. So in cognitive psychology, the psychology of how the human mind works, the sub part of that, how the human mind begins to learn to read and develops as a reader, is the most well-studied part of cognitive psychology. Very little of that has gotten into educational practice, which is why we're in the situation we're in, or one of the reasons why, a major one. But it's extraordinarily well studied. So rather than just a summary of each, I tried to present how it evolved. How did our understanding of how children begin to recognize words evolve? And how did they learn to do it with automaticity? Because the 5th grade level recognizes a word in about 0.23 seconds, well, exactly on average. So how does that evolve? And then how does fluency evolve? Because you can recognize words with automaticity and pronounce them accurately, but that doesn't mean you're fluent. So I presented the history of the research in word recognition and fluency and in the growth of vocabulary and the growth of knowledge, and then took a look at the comprehension, the research on comprehension, which was perhaps the most interesting. And that's pretty much how I went about it. Meredith, you want to add to that?
I think the net effect of that is there's a narrative arc to each of these. I think that's why it's readable and accessible. I guess it's historical, but the evolution is the better word. It's just like how our understanding has deepened over time and what difference each of those makes to the other culminates in the comprehension piece, which I think is the most radical. This understanding of how the mind makes sense of language when it's in written form, and how all the parts of reading contribute to that is, I think, the sort of deepest insight that I guess I didn't fully realize it until we were producing this work. I didn't have that same story to think about. And I think that's a game changer.
And I'm just going to add for folks, because Meredith and I took David's synthesis and then, worked to put it into the paper. But if any of you know David, have listened to David, been around David, it's an enjoyable read. Like, he's made it accessible. It is interesting and illuminating, if I can say that, because it's not like I don't know about you, but I'll go online, I'll pull down a research paper, and I find them hard to get through a lot of the times. I'm just going to be honest with you. And I have a law degree and I find them hard to get through, but this is not that. This is very much like, here's all the things we know and how long we've known it. And this is what it means in the classroom. So those of you who know David will know that it's an interesting read. I just want to say that.
Absolutely. And David, you talked a little bit about the comprehension piece. That also, in every one of the 5 accelerators, I have to say to you, I learned something new because of the way you put the information together. But if you can talk a little bit about both the comprehension piece, because I think it would be interesting to whet people's appetite in terms of that synthesis. And then also, when you talked about marshaling evidence and communicating it when it's speaking and writing, you really made a point about the connection of reading and writing. So can you talk a little bit more about these 2 accelerators? Okay.
Sue is the one who actually connected reading and writing.
Oh, good.
I'll leave that for her. One of the things I tried to get at in the synthesis is that we treat comprehension as if it's an entity in itself. And it's not, because if you can't decode the words on the page, you don't comprehend. If you can't decode the word with automaticity, you don't comprehend. And then if you don't read with fluency, if you read too slowly or read too fastly or have no sense of how to parse the phrases within the sentence or how to move from sentence to sentence, then you don't comprehend. If there's too many words on the page that you don't know the meaning of, even if you pronounce them correctly and recognize them, then you don't comprehend. If there's too many references in the text to concepts or ideas or events or people or institutions or time periods, and this is just as true for fiction as it is nonfiction. That's why I was really careful to use Charlotte's Web as my example for comprehension, because who the hell hasn't read Charlotte's Web? You have to turn in your license if you're an elementary school teacher and you haven't read Charlotte's Web. So if you don't put if those aren't all working and working effectively, then there is no comprehension. But the interesting question is, suppose they are working effectively, then what's left? What's left to study of comprehension? And there's a bunch of things that are really interesting. One is, can you connect the parts of the text? Can you connect different parts of the text? Another is, can you recognize what evidence is relevant and what evidence is not relevant in order to make an inference that you need to know to understand the text? Can you connect the text to your knowledge when you need it? And there's interesting research done by a bunch of people in England, Oak Hill and I forgot the name of the second one, but and we can send this research to anybody we want. It says sometimes even when students have the knowledge, they don't make the connections. And well, why would that be? Why would some students connect to their knowledge that they have and others not? And it turns out that there's some students who don't recognize what is the relevant information in their knowledge that they need to connect to the text, or what is the relevant information in the text that they need to connect to their knowledge. So those are some of the elements of comprehension. And I think the next question, there'll be a little more about that I'll add on the next question. Yeah. But I want to leave room for Sue.
I do, before I pass it on to Sue, I do want to point out something that really stood out to me, which is the importance of curation of the right texts, right? Rich, complex texts, and never limiting student reading exclusively to their designated independent or instructional reading level. Kids need experience in all kinds of texts, but without exposure to rich, complex texts, we're not going to reach that level that you were talking about, which I thought was so important. But Sue, go ahead, talk to us a little bit more about the combining reading and writing. So often people don't have that idea of integration.
Exactly. So it probably just makes sense, right? I mean, to write about what you read, but I don't know why we don't do more of that in schooling. And there's research that shows that when you write about what you read, and you can think about this in your own life, it focuses your attention, right? It makes you a more careful reader. When you have to explain something to somebody else, whether you're doing that orally or you're doing it in writing, it makes your comprehension grows. And there's research that shows that. Sort of beyond that, sort of as you suggested, Amelia, it's one of the skills that college professors and employers, a lot of them, not all jobs, but a lot of them ask your students, your employees to do. It's one of the most highly rated one. And it's not just about writing. It's not just about being grammatically correct. It's about, as David was suggesting and what you've suggested about complex text, it's what have you understood about this? What can you say about this? What can you argue about this? What questions does this come up for you? So it's a way of sort of locking, I think, knowledge in your brain when you have to actually put it down on paper or talk about it to others. And the other thing, just to bring equity in here, one of the things that sometimes we tell students, go off and write about something, right? sometimes students go like what? Well, what? And some students may have a lot of ideas, and some students may have like, I don't know, give me one. But here, when you're writing about a text or writing about text that you've read or you've researched, it sort of equalizes the playing field. We're all focused on, we may be writing about different things. Our ideas may be different, which is wonderful, but we've all had access to those texts. We've all talked about them to one another. And now I can then create something in writing, but I don't have to feel like, well, gosh, I don't even know what I should be writing about. So there's lots of, in order to make the comprehension piece work, and David, check me on this, but for when you're in a classroom, you want to hear what students are saying. You want to see what students are writing to see, like, are they getting it? And also to create, the other thing to say about the comprehension piece is that it really is about the social context. It's about, I know something and Tanji knows something and Meredith noticed something else, and together we're understanding the text even better because of that. So, and that's the way the teacher knows, is because they've seen the discussions or watched a group project together or students writing. So that's why it really does connect and support comprehension.
Wow. I hope you're as excited as I am just hearing them talk. But let's move on. The science of reading has been getting a lot of attention these days. And your report is so thorough and comprehensive. David, I'm going to turn to you first, and then Tanji and others. What is missing from the overall conversation on the science of reading, and how do you think this report helps to address the shortcomings?
Most of the discourse around the science of reading has been narrowed down to only phonics, to systematic phonics instruction, especially in the early years, which any of you who've seen any of my work or Students Achievement Partners work knows that we've been advocating that for years, and it's absolutely true. But it's not the entirety of the science of reading. There's a science of reading behind how you become fluent. There's a science of reading behind how vocabulary is learned and how vocabulary grows, and the best way to do that, which gets very little attention. There's a science of reading about how to grow knowledge and the role of knowledge in comprehension, which is not as simple as the more you know, the better reader you are. It's not as simple as that. And that gets no attention. And there's the science of reading behind why complex text. Why is the ability to read complex text the best predictor of success in college and careers? In order to answer that question, you have to have an understanding of what makes a text complex and what doesn't make a text complex. And that too is a science that has been well studied. So there's far more to the science of reading than just phonics. And there's also far more to the science of reading than just knowledge. So it's almost like we have two ends of a continuum that is being thrown out to the educational world now. If you have a systematic phonics program, which I greatly believe in, we didn't have one in the school that Meredith and I started, and we did terribly because of that. And then we got one, and that was the beginning of an improvement, but it wasn't the end of improvement. It was just the beginning of improvement. So we kind of got these bookends on the science of reading. Grow knowledge, and if you grow knowledge, everything will be okay. And there's really some people I have enormous respect for who say that. They're wrong, but they say that. Just grow knowledge and you're good to go. And then there's another whole, on the other end of the continuum, is just teach systematic phonics, do it right, and then you're good to go. That's the science of reading. Reading is one of the most complex things that we ask everybody in this country to do. I imagine programming these cars that Google and other companies are doing so that they can drive without an engine, without a driver. I imagine that's pretty complex as well. Well, you know what? We're not asking a lot of people to do that programming, but we're asking everybody in our country to learn to read. And it's the most complex process that the human mind learns to do in the context of education. Simplifying it to just know more and do systematic phonics is not going to help us. And of course, all of that leaves out all kinds of equity issues that Tanji will address.
Tanji.
Thank you, David. I think David's obviously right. I would not be one to argue with him because I know better, as do most of us. No, we're not going to do that, at least not today.
I won't either.
Yeah. And I think the idea about what's missing is exactly that, that we have taken a very kind of reductive approach to understanding what reading is meant to be and what and who can do it and who can't do it. And I also think what to David's other point, the complexity of it, like people don't understand that your brain is not wired to do this thing called reading. So you have to lay down a brain functioning that enables you to acquire the thing we call reading. And I also think the way in which we try to get groups of people to, particularly young children, it's all about loving reading because like you got to go out in the world and love it. And if a child doesn't love reading, then we think that they can't do the reading. And I do lots of things that I don't love how to do, but I know I got to do it. And so, you know, the idea that it's all got to be one or the other and kids have to love it in order to do it, I think is something this paper really helps to address and break down and get people to understand that reading is about an ability to be free in your world, right? Because if I can read, yes, I want someone reading to me. Like, I love nothing else than reading to my 2-year-old grandson all day, twice on Sunday. Thank you. But he has to get to a point in his life where he's dependent upon me or his parents or other adults for his knowledge building. And so this idea about acquiring the skill and the ability to take letters, turn them into words, make sense of them, is about moving people towards a level of independent living and freedom for their own empowerment. And I think that's part of the underlying equity thread that we try to get in this paper.
And if you have not read the paper yet, that is the through line across the entire paper, that and personalization. It's beautifully done. So
I have to say something quickly.
yes.
I've always had this feeling about everybody doesn't have to love reading, but I've been too chicken shit to say it. Tanji has freed me to be able to say that.
Say it, David. You don't gotta love it, but you gotta do it.
Well, and the
You gotta
idea
do
that sometimes reading is really hard. And I want to take a moment here and ask you, like, I recently read a book by Mark Seidenberg, Reading at the Speed of Sight. And it reminded me of this report because it was a hard book to read. And if I was just going for the liking, I would not have gotten to chapter 2, but I had to stick with it and come back and take notes and highlight. So what book did you read during this process that really stayed with you?
Me personally, it wasn't during this process. My coming to that idea about it is historically, particularly from the lens of African-American people and the struggle that we've had being able to learn to read, right? So this idea that African-American people were denied the right, the express right to read, to learn how to write, because their owners understood the power of being literate, right? So because you understand what it means to be literate, you understand that that person now is empowered and you don't have control over them. So we don't argue about whether aspects of sports are hard. We don't do that.
No.
We don't argue about whether or not a person who wants to acquire that mechanic skill, whether that's hard or not. We don't argue that. We don't ask them to stop doing that thing because that thing is hard. When it comes to academics and reading, if it is hard, we then try to give children escape hatches out of it, as opposed to helping them really understand that this is about your life and your liberation and your ability to have agency and empowered agency through the world. And so we have to really push against this notion that if it's hard, they can't do it, like you said, right? And so it was really my own cultural and racial understanding about, like, I'm a person who now gets to read, when if I had been born 2-3 centuries ago, I wouldn't be. And so I bring that express idea to the notion of why literacy and reading are so important. And I ask leaders and teachers just one simple question: Do you want every single kid that you have the privilege and charge to teach to learn how to read? And I haven't met one person who said no. But I meet a lot of people who use tactics and strategies that are not proven. So then you go back and answer my question. Do you want them all to learn how, or don't you? And so that's kind of the vein that I took when we all started talking about this, and why we took the approaches that we took. I think it was really important to elevate this conversation around reading, that it's a multiplicity of sciences that David has already talked about, but it's even more than that. It gets down to crucial levels of humanity and whether you want people to be their own agents in their lives.
Drop the mic. Tanji, you remind me, I'm from Brazil, and in 1982, I studied at the Catholic University, and one of my professors was Paulo Freire.
Freire, he's my new ex-boyfriend.
Okay. But you reminded me of him talking just now, because he always brought down to power at the core of everything. So anybody wants to add either like your drive, your values, or a book that you would recommend, a combination of things?
I just want to add a bravo to Tanji. I mean, I think one of the big mistakes we make in education is thinking that kids want to do easy work, that they don't want to be challenged. The fact of the matter is that when we challenge them, it shows we respect their brains. We know they can do it. Everybody at the same speed on everything? Okay, no. But the point is, we want to be challenged, and we know when we are not. I just to say it, in another lifetime, I traveled district to district, and when districts were hiring me, and I say, I want to talk to students. I want to talk to students, and they'd say, oh, we'll get a group together. I said, no, I don't want like the student leaders and the high rock, whatever. I want the students who are, because we know there's tracking, and we know it still exists, and we know it's systematic. And I'd say, no, I want to talk to them. I want to talk to a group of them. And I'm telling you, it didn't matter where I was, in the South, the North, the East, or the West. These kids, it's like they called one another and said, we want to do what the quote unquote smart kids are able to do. We want to do interesting things. We see students in those classes talking. We see students in those classes creating things. We don't want to do what we're doing. And so somehow teachers, and it's so incredible to me. And I think it's so, when you think about it, sort of contrary to how we talk about ourselves as Americans, is that we decide early on who got it and who doesn't, who's got the brain and who doesn't, and it can be done, and it can be based on things that have nothing to do with brains, by the way. It can be do with how a student is dressed, the color of a student's skin, the language a student comes to school with, and we make these determinations, and then we deny them, and they know we're not respecting their brains. They know that. They know we don't think they're up to it, and so we're not fooling them. And on top of that, we're hurting them. We're hurting them from believing in themselves. So bravo to Tanji and how she talked about it. And then just one personal note, Tanji, I'm going to tell my granddaughter, she doesn't have to love reading. She used to love it, and then she stopped loving it. And I just said, and I said, well, you don't have to love it. You just have to do it. So do it. Right. So I'm going to tell her, I heard from Tanji B. Marshall, you don't have to love it.
Just get to she'll get back to it. We all get back to it. Like we all get I don't want to cook every day, but I got to eat. So there's that, right?
Hello. So anyway, thanks.
That's right.
Sue, I do want to mention something. I coached at a school in North Carolina, our solutions, and I was coaching 3, 4, 5. And the special ed kids for the first time became a part of the general ed learning community, this intellectual community. And they did not want to get pulled out anymore. No more. They wanted to participate because there were rich discussions on the same topic. The registers of language were growing, their vocabulary was growing. And because of the pedagogy that connected the reading with the writing, they were able to do much more. And the teachers began talking about how the way they sat and the way they taught changed. And I remember we brought some visitors from Colorado to visit that school. And the visitors walked into the classroom and they asked the teachers, who can we talk to? And the teacher said, anybody, talk to anybody you want. And so and she told the kids, if you want to share something, you feel free to get up and go share with the visitors. And the first kids that got up were kids that were special ed. But the visitors, after talking to the kids and the amount of information they knew, afterwards, the teacher said those kids were kids that were in special ed, pull out. And the visitors could not believe it. But that tells you that we can do better things for kids that changes their lives. But let's talk about personalization, because in this report, I think this is one of the areas that can add so much to our knowledge base in decision making. But you say personalized learning in literacy education is an approach in which teaching and other learning experiences build on each student's strengths, address each student's needs, spur student motivation and agency, and help all students meet grade level standards and ultimately achieve college, career, and I'll add life readiness. In this report, you address personalization and what we know and what we don't know. Can you talk a little bit about this and what surprised you the most? So I'll start with you and then I'll open to everybody.
Okay, so so a couple of things here. I'll speak for myself, but I think Meredith and Tanji were with me on this, but if not, they'll correct me. But so I was a personalization skeptic when I started this, because in the name of personalization, I have seen just what Tanji talked about. Which is why grade level, spurring students to grade level work, giving student agency a place. It's an approach, it's not a product. Because what I think can happen is in the name of personalization, they'll say, oh, well, you aren't up to this, Sue, so we're gonna stick you over here in front of a computer or a program, or we're gonna put you in a special class, or we're gonna do whatever. So we had to fight quite a bit as we named this, did we not? Because we thought it was really real, which is an equity portion about personalization. So one of the things that surprised me most for me is that once you build and anchor equity into it, both into who gets assigned what, the products themselves, and you build equity into that, and you tie it to content. So it's not just some program or something, why you're doing it, and there's pieces there. I said, oh, okay, I can kind of get with this. This can be cool stuff, especially around student agency and student interest and giving students more practice. I think one of the other things that surprised me a lot was that personalization has been around for the millennia, but there's very little efficacy research. And by efficacy research, I mean both that it does what it says it's going to do, so it helps students in certain ways, but also that students like it, that it's interesting to them, that they have real agency, as opposed to it's just another thing that's being done to them. So I think that there's a whole range of research that needs to come along. Because I was surprised. It's mainly in math that there's some efficacy research. And I saw one of your people who signed in, who said they're a tutor, and there is efficacy research on one-to-one tutoring. So there is some efficacy research there. But other than that, it's kind of like non-existent. Doesn't mean personalization is bad, or a personalization approach or a program is bad. It just means you have to know that you have to look deeper to see what its real use is. So I'll stop there and let Meredith and Tanji weigh in.
Yeah, I think the surprise also was that so little research exists around it, but I also think what we found was the importance of it being so connected to existing work and not being in the corner in the one-off, right? That it has to be connected to very strong core instruction, which I think what's been happening these days, particularly with, schools reopening after the remote learning, is that everyone is taking a remediation perspective, and hopefully they will use this paper to thwart some of that. But we found that it's really, really important that you take this lens that students have to have the types of academic supports they need in relation to a core, very strong core instructional program.
Absolutely. And there's a part that you talk about is not just putting kids in front of computers, right? Which has become the norm in so many places. Meredith, go ahead.
Yeah, we were writing this against the backdrop, of course, of kids learning remotely and fearing this idea of learning loss and, deficit language. So, and that was, I think we all were skeptics. Because the other thing is personalization is so often unyoked, as Tanji just said, from content. This idea that it's as good in and of itself to, this idea, because people have in their heads that, every child a custom individualized plan, that's not, first of all, it's not good for kids, right? Because learning is so deeply social and we're so connected to each other, and we need Western tradition sometimes unyokes from that socialness and that communal responsibility and that sense of what I owe to the other and what the other brings to me. So what we found when we dug into the best results, they were deeply personal. They were human to human interactions, and a human drove the personalization, not machine learning. By and large, it's good for some drilling. It's useful. There's an efficiency to it, but it's not humane and personal in the way that's going to connect to deeper learning outcomes. So what surprised us is that the field of personalized learning experts kind of agreed with us, but yet they had never connected to content and connected to communal values, hardly at all. And it took us a long time before we found a few pockets of groups that actually approached it that way and thoroughly endorsed our approach. So that was a surprise, A, that there was anybody doing that, but also that it had never occurred to anybody that just this thing for its own sake as a bright, shiny object yielded no results whatsoever and was not in fact good for children, in any guise.
David, do you want to add anything?
Well, two things. It's interesting that the research on how do tech programs enhance reading proficiency have very little positive results. But even when they're based on the research, like there are reading foundational skills programs that are clearly based on research, and still they don't seem to work. And I think the message is that kids need teachers. They need that human connection in order to learn and how to read, which is more or less what Meredith and Tandy and Sue were all of them were saying. I would add something that came before that when Sue and Tandy were talking about efficacy. There is some research, by the way, with literacy in a whole body of work by a guy named Guthrie, showing that when students learn to read in the context of a topic and following a topic, not only does comprehension increase, but efficacy increases. So there is some research there.
Yes.
The other thing is the idea, as I think Sue said, of when you give dumbed down work, you're insulting kids is absolutely true, because they'll recognize it as such. But it's also important for them to understand why they're struggling, because kids, when they reach the older grades, middle school or even upper elementary and certainly high school, who are struggling with reading look around and they say, well, I was in the same school as these kids and I had the same teachers and I had the same reading program, but they're doing way better than I am. Why is that? You have to address that directly. You have to show them that the reason they're in that situation is their foundational skills instruction, in fact, was not based on science. That it did not work for all kids. And they carried that as a weight around their shoulders for the rest of their educational career. And it can be, and therefore it came from improper instruction, which came from what teachers learned about how to teach reading. And that albatross or that weight that they carried through the grades can in fact be corrected by approaching it with the right kind of instruction now. You have to make it clear to them based on the science, based literally on how the brain learns to read, that it does not reflect intelligence. And Meredith and I, with Student Achievement Partners, are working on a project to basically a module or a unit to address that very activity. And that module or that unit is going to begin with what's called a graphic guide to reading, which is essentially a 20-page comic book on how the brain learns to, on exactly what I just discussed, how the brain learns to read, how it's not connected to intelligence, and how it can be corrected.
Well, maybe you can add some volumes, one for each accelerator, because they're going to want to know the rest of the story. So let's talk. Okay, one of my favorite things, because like Tenji, my background really, I'm an equity warrior, and I really believe that all kids deserve to have equitable access, high expectations, and the right supports. But equity here takes a prominent role, and that is different from other science of reading research or papers that I have read. And I do want you, and Tenji, I'm gonna start with you, but I do want you to talk about the 3 principles of equity that you highlight. And if you don't mind, I'm gonna read the 3rd principle, which I thought was so important. You say, equity can't work as an afterthought or superficial gesture. It needs to be baked into instruction from the start, whether whole class, small group, or personalized. That means designing education tools and techniques to intentionally meet the needs of students from historically marginalized and underserved groups, including Black students, students learning English, and students currently experiencing poverty. That means supporting an equity first method. Wow. So,
Yeah. Well, I think one, we have to admit some things up front about what education has already done, right? So we have to admit that education is designed for inequity, right? So it's designed for there to be the very inequitable outcomes that we get going, right? So we get them this way because when you have school systems that are perpetually underfunded because of the way we fund schools, then you're going to get the predictable outcomes that keep happening by the groups you named. And so in order to reverse that, and in order to really address that, we have to come clean and admit that that's what's happening. And so in order to get to the kind of reading practices that we're going to allow every student in every class, in every building, in every state across the country to really achieve the kind of reading we want, then we have to make sure it is explicitly part of the process. And I think that's what it is, right? And I think that's what we really attempted to do, and that those principles mean that you have to be willing to name the inequities up front, right? And so in order to redress them, then you must be explicit about what has to happen so that students from the groups you named are now not just centered, because if you center one, then you automatically think that you have to decenter somebody else. And we're not talking about centering versus decentering. What we're saying is making space for every kid, right? And so in that sense, we're not doing the zero-sum game that we normally do about education, about who gets and doesn't get. We're saying that through reading and through proper instruction, personalized instruction that really attends to what students need, that they learn how to read, then we'll be able to hopefully stem the effects of the predictive outcomes that we get by race and income, and sometimes by gender, and sometimes by students who are adding English to their language repertoire.
I do, Tenji, want you to expand a little bit, because accepting that we are a part of a system that maintains the status quo is difficult for people, right? So what is the best way of using this report to look at things in a different way? Because the first time I read the report, I even thought about MTSS and how MTSS is typically set up and talked about. And I thought how this report can change the conversation around MTSS and what is a strong tier one, and then the continue. Because if you don't have a strong tier one, you're not going to have a continued.
Right. We can stop talking right then, right?
But how can this can be a difficult topic? How can we use, and this is for you and any of the four of you, how can we use this report to start talking about what must be done for all kids to be in the bubble, not to leave some out, right? But everybody's a part of the circle. So how do we increase the circle?
I think one of the things that has to happen, one, you need to read it, all 88 pages of it. I know, like, it's a long paper. But I think in order to really get underneath the hood and kick some tires around what's going on and say a practice where every student is not excelling, where all students are not learning how to read, what this report allows you to do is really understand the mechanisms necessary to ensure that you are attending to the research, that you understand that there is a process and it's not singular. It is not just, you're in the phonics camp or you're in the comprehension camp or you're in the whatever camp you're in. This is not about being in a particular camp. This is about getting to every student the ability to learn how to read. So I think even if a person is saying, I don't want to deal with inequity. Okay, take it off the page. But do you want every kid to learn how to read though?
Yeah.
Right. Like, so I don't want to deal with the language of bias and racism. Okay, don't. But do you want every kid to learn how to read though? And so taking that perspective, this report allows people to deal with, one, it increases their own knowledge around the structures of reading. And then it gives them some possibilities about how to think through what can get done to ensure all kids can read, right? So if we're talking about, and it gives them that perspective about reading as liberation, and actually lowers the threat on the worry of whether they like it or not. Like it lowers the threat level on some things, right? And it also enables educators to have the real conversation about what they have been doing. So if I have been doing personalized learning in a way that has been isolating, what this report allows you to do is, number one, recognize it, but then number two, it gives you some strategies and some understanding about, my way of doing this has not been serving kids because I'm not taking that humane approach. I am not bringing kids into the conversation of holistic learning with everybody. And by holistic, I don't mean whole language. I mean holistic centered learning that is humane and communicative. That's what I mean. So I think what the report does, it opens avenues for, as you've been saying, Amelia, that it really can change the very way in which we think about reading instruction, and that it allows educators to more deeply understand their own practices and processes, and gives them something else to think about.
And that's what stood out to me, that the way equity and personalization were placed at the center, but it was not beliefs, it was not guilt,
Actions.
it was practices practices and behaviors. So you're not dealing with people's beliefs. We're trying to change their practices, and then the beliefs will come later. But that's what I loved about this. Anybody else wants to add? And then we have a question here, Camille, that has a question for us, but I wanted to see if David, Sue, or Meredith want to add something to this equity conversation.
The only thing, lots to add because it's really important, but I think some of what, Tangi's been talking about, David and Meredith, is that there's a teacher involved here. There's a human being involved here. And students need to feel safe, and they need to feel respected, and they need, if to the extent you can give them agency, or maybe we should think more broadly about how we give students agency. I know that the art curriculum itself gives students agency in terms of right, in terms of what they all read a text, and then they're able to go research in an area. To me, that's personalization at its best, where students can begin to choose what they're most interested in and go forward and work in groups in that. So I think there's a real role here for educators to think about who their students are, and to imagine themselves way back when as a student sitting in a class, and knowing who these students are, wanting to know who these students are, that they all come with certain experiences and funds of knowledge that can be shared in the community of students, and building that. So I feel like there's just this huge role here and responsibility, really, for teachers. So yes, it's the content, yes, but then there's the delivery of that with kindness and humanity, I think, as Tangi has underscored.
We can't, not that anybody's advocating for this, but we've been saying it all along, to the opposite, that we can't separate any of these things. And we can't separate the different the different components of reading that are in my research synthesis. And we can't separate equity and efficacy. ARC, full disclosure, I get paid to help ARC, but I also get paid to help about 4 or 5 other publishers. But a way that ARC brings in efficacy when it's done right is through the choice that surrounds the core text. And I remember in a school that was using ARC, and I forget the module, it doesn't matter, but I was talking to 2 students in front of the room. It was 5th grade. There was a boy, very mature boy, who clearly was an excellent reader. And next to him, a very small girl who was struggling. But they were reading together the core text, and clearly he was helping her, and I'm not in that work with the core text. And so we engaged in this discussion about the core text. And I was about to go, but the girl who was the weaker reader then reaches into a desk and pulls out, "But I want to show you my research." Because in ARC, everybody has a subtopic that they research. So if they're studying the American Revolution, someone might study Crispus Attucks, someone might be studying the Constitution, the boat, someone might be studying African Americans during the Revolution, women during the Revolution. Everybody chooses something, and I don't remember what her topic was, but clearly she was a struggling reader. But she felt to reach into her desk, and she was so happy to show me her book and talk about her research. So it's an example of connecting the pedagogy to the efficacy. If you have a leveled system, where you have a system where either A, you're separating the weak readers all the time, or all of your text, as we've said, is only text that you can read at your level. Because this girl was reading text at a more complex level with support. And when she pulled out her book, that was at a lower complexity level, but that was her report. But reading a series of texts at a lower complexity level does grow knowledge and does grow vocabulary. So all of that, so you have everything coming together: the growing of knowledge, the growing of vocabulary, the learning about the world, and the efficacy. And that you can catch that in that one moment with those 2 kids.
And I think you make that very clear in the report when you talk about access to multiple texts around the same topic and the impact of that on vocabulary and knowledge and comprehension. Michelle, can you or Kristen Dial read Camille Cox's question to the panelists, please?
Sure thing. It says, wanting to persuade my colleagues to teach kids who are behind in reading, even though there are no systems in place to improve literacy and make content accessible. The district I'm in is unfortunately only making content accessible at the high school level, but not teaching literacy to those students who are at the 3rd grade level, for instance. My own classroom, I'm thinking of a flipped classroom so I can address these needs instead of relegating catch up to homework. What advice do you have?
Well, if you're talking about students written at a 3rd grade level, I think she's talking about high school. Is that right, Michelle?
That's what I'm getting from it. Yeah, that there are some kids that are still working on things like foundational skills. Yep.
You have to integrate their work in foundational skills into the tier 1 instruction and into the content. I mean, I believe you also have to stop tracking these kids because that's not going to help anybody.
Not that. Just don't do it.
Yeah, but getting high schools to give up. High schools don't give up tracking because it's a power issue. Red Candy, tracking is a policy. It's a racist policy. And we don't address it nearly as much as we in the educational world are not addressing it nearly as much as we should. But nevertheless, in this case, since you're not going to convince assuming you're not going to convince this high school to detract, what you have to do as much as possible is connect foundational skill work to content, because otherwise, why do the kids see a need to do it? You will just fail. It will just fail. And for part of my work that I mentioned earlier, we've been synthesizing research on interventions, of which there are hundreds of studies of interventions, thousands. Almost none of them, not almost, none of them bring high school kids up to anywhere near the average level of reading proficiency. And that's because they isolate the kids and make them feel poorly about themselves. And then they don't connect it to the content that they're learning in their classes or to any content. So as much as possible, if you can connect these students' foundational skills work to content, that would be my recommendation. And there's more, but I don't know if you're going to be able to change more at this point, but that's a start.
Meredith, can you
also
talk
think-
about the high school course that you and David are offering?
Sure. I just want to, but I want to just point at another through line here that the words have been spoken, but it's time to remind people, we're really talking about access, the equity inherent in access to grade level and college and career ready education for children for all ages. So there's also, you have to always ask, how can I give everybody access here? They're all sitting in my room. They all deserve that access. So the power of access, yes, you want to catch kids up in reading, but without a lot of knowledge and a lot of energy and support, you can do what you can do. You can target fluency pretty easily. There's, but David just scratched the tip of the iceberg there. So this does feel like one of the major sort of tension points in this country right now is what the heck do we do with older students who are years away, as you described in your comment. So we've developed a course. It's through Student Achievement Partners we call it IROS, Improving Reading for Older Students. And the demand has been rather overwhelming. About 1,500 people sign up for each time. It's an asynchronous course. So we created, experiences. It's self-paced. And then there are these really vibrant discussion threads that are in real time. And we have facilitators responding, but we encourage the community to take responsibility for each other. We kind of model what we want to see in the classroom. That you as a learning community need to help lift everybody and correct misunderstandings or reinforce and validate other people's experiences. We are now making that course available to completers to take home with them for PLC or whatever. So that is, I don't know if I can I'll dig a link out when I'm not talking, but I just,
we will make sure that we send a link to people.
Yeah,
who are
it's going to
interested.
run again in the late fall. It's just finishing now. We run it 3 or 4 times. So there will be at least one more run of course, and anybody who wants to send a team through it and then take it home forever, we're bundling the course as a free resource. Well, there's a bundling cost, but there's no permissions or license. It's we just want to get it out as a resource. And unfortunately, I wish I could point to something other than David's in my little course, but there's not enough out there meeting this need right now. It's a screaming need.
But we do have a dream.
And
we do have a dream. Student Achievement Partners, which is we call it HACK, Humanities Accelerator course, which really looks to do away with tracking. I saw a note in here about, well, what do you do about students if you do away with tracking? Some students need foundational skills because they didn't get it before, right? Not because they're stupid, because they didn't get it. And then you have other students who read perfectly well. Well, that's a perfect time for personalization for all students. Oh, no, hear me, all students. So some students might need some foundational skills work in conjunction also with something that might interest them. And other students who are reading at grade level are able to handle it or just about there. They too can personalize and grow their skills through their research. And like we just heard about what ARC does. So there are ways here to personalize, have some. Don't lose the sense of all students learning about the same stuff, reading the same stuff with supports, but then allowing students, and some students may need some more teacher support than others in some cases, but all students are allowed to personalize, or the teacher helps to personalize it so they get that. And I'll let anybody else, David or Meredith or Tangi speak a little more to that. But we have this dream about stop the tracking, like halt, done, over, extend the literacy.
I see one more talk coming up, but we do have to wrap up.
Okay.
I want to call attention though to what I read about equity, and it cannot work as an afterthought. And I think so often high school programs that is not the focus. And I think that is one of the reasons why our core, the high school, got all green. It's not just because of the alignment to standards, but it is because this equity was not an afterthought for kids. So, but I want to finish, and you will come back. I will invite you back. But I want to finish with, so we want everybody to read this report. What is your favorite part of this report? And after this past year, everything we have gone through, and now we are getting kids back, teachers back. Based on this report and your favorite part, what is the one thing you want every superintendent and assistant superintendent to remember? And I want to hear from everybody, and I'm going to start with you, Tangi.
Rather than say a favorite part, because I think that would be, for me, I don't think I can do it. I think the part that I really do like the most is, I really have to say, I enjoyed working on it to get the research out. I think that we do a disservice to teachers and educators because we tend to say they can't handle theory and they can't handle research. So I think my favorite parts of this were the care taken to get the research out and on the page for educators to sort of absorb and internalize for their own practice. When I want every superintendent, CAO, educator, building leader, coach, parent, whoever is going to read this article, this paper, I think I want them to come away with an idea that in order for the kinds of educational and academic success we want for every kid, we have to approach this from this acronym that a rigorous and relevant and responsive education starts from the premise that every child's intellect matters, that is respect. And so this piece of text really hones in on that model of respect. And I think that's what it really tries to do. So I think that's what I would want them to understand.
Thank you. Thank you. David.
I was in a 10th grade class that was reading Oedipus. And there was a section of the text where the chorus, I guess, I don't have the classical background that my wife does, but I think whoever is the narrator was said, a man can be judged evil in a moment. In order to judge a man as good, it requires a lifetime. And I stopped and said, that's really interesting. Is that true? And I thought about it for a minute. There was no mention of that whatsoever in the lesson, none. When you do that, well, first of all, I'll say, why do you think there was no mention of that? That's a pretty interesting idea, because that wasn't the standard that they were addressing that day. When you teach reading that way, you are punishing the good reader. The good reader stops and thinks about it, and it can't even raise their hand because it has nothing to do with standard two today, so we can't talk about it. So you punish the good reader, and you reinforce the ineffective habits of the weak reader. The weak reader blows right by it, doesn't get it at all. By teaching reading as a series of discrete skills or discrete standards, as opposed to looking at the whole text and putting text at the center, which is a paper on students' achievement partners, you fail to help the students we need to help the most. The naturally great readers will doesn't matter. They'll ignore that nonsense about we're only approaching on standard 4 today. Sorry, lady, but I'm going to read for the whole thing. But the weak readers, we are reinforcing their bad habits every single day. So if what I would want superintendents or CAOs, et cetera, to understand is this idea of teaching a strategy at a time or a standard at a time, because every text presents its own unique difficulties and unique understandings. In essence, every text, as I think I wrote somewhere else, is a frozen kaleidoscope and differs from the next text when you move the control knob. And we've been doing it wrong forever.
So David is talking about Accelerator 5. And if you are a CAO, please stop asking
Number
what
5.
is the standard of the day. All right.
Stop that. Yes, please stop that.
Meredith, you.
Well, I was going to talk about that rich comprehension section too in the interweave, but I want to talk about that idea of access again and the uncomfortable truth that we are accepting warehousing about 50% of our students, and we always have, and none of us came into education to do that. And so we have to find ways to access students, and we have to give access to literacy to every student and provide that access. And personalization is not, it cannot serve to keep that warehousing going. It must be used in service of elevating and lifting every kid's access to what everybody deserves to have, the rich work of that grade level, the intellectual discourse that we share, and the community building around that.
Thank you. Sue.
Yeah, so I've got one, yes, one practical for the superintendents and so on. There is a section in the paper called the consideration questions. And it tells you, if you're thinking, because we've heard, I don't know if this is true of everybody, we've heard there's a flood of money out there, right? So figure out how to use it really well. And the first is to get a really good curriculum, high quality instructional materials in there, and then figure out what has to get supplemented and how to supplement it. And then it gives a whole list of questions about if you're going to go for a personalization approach, what do you need? What does it mean about student agency? Has equity been built in? What if there's efficacy research on it, for what students is it efficacious? So there's a whole sort of like, it tells you sort of like how to get through it. So that's what I'd say. Well, my other big play is when students come back to you, can we not look at them like they're damaged goods? Can we not look at them like they need a bunch of remediation? Their brains did not stop working. They kept learning. We are where we are. Deal with the brilliance in them and don't look at them like, oh my gosh, there's just so much we have to do to you. It's like, welcome them back with all of the wondrous things that have happened, hard things too, but wondrous things as opposed to the other. So I beg of you. And don't test, and then think kids are behind, because you give kids a test when they walk in the door or pretty soon after. What are you going to do to them? And then you're going to make decisions based on a test that doesn't even tell you what the student knows. So anyway, that is my greatest plea.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you said it.
Thank you so much for this time. I'll treasure it forever. You each are my heroes. We look up to you. You influence our work. And please read this report. And also, there are 3 appendices that have pretty good questions, guidance. So don't forget, and we will be back next month, August 26th, with Sonia Cabo, and she's going to be talking about really the 5 accelerators starting early on. So thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.